So, welcome to the Ratio Institute's web TV, where we discuss and explain research and its implications to the current policy and economic debate. I must say that it's a great honor here to have Professor Naomi Lamoreaux with us today to start this webcast. And we have a link on the web with all her material on, where you can dig into books and articles and so on. But and shortly, her career has been covering a large number of topics in economic history, like corporate governance, law and economics, the use of patents, and so on, and particularly looking at these long-term trends and how that can inform policy and how to explain those, which is a quite challenging task. And then one topic that has been part of her study is asymmetric information, trying to see how this cooperation works between different partners in the economy. And she will tell more about that, I'm sure. And speaking personally, I've had some contacts with Naomi over the past years, and they've been quite inspired by her work on patents. So let me say to you again, welcome to this web TV, and welcome, Naomi, and we're very happy to have you here.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So let's start a little bit with some general questions about your work, and then we can go to some specific topics maybe. So if we start with the economics history here, so why do you think that is sort of important when it comes to informing and understanding the economy and society, and then the implications for policy?
Well, everything around the world today, everything we experience is the result of processes that have been at work over the long run. And if we don't think about those processes and how they've produced the society that we're a part of, we're likely to misunderstand that society. So history is very important for understanding the present because it produced the present.
Mm. So, and how does that sort of, is your approach then in your research to get to the root of these mechanisms that are at play and these dynamics that you try to explain?
Well, my method is what I would call indirect. So if you start at the present and ask the same questions that current policymakers ask, your ability to see the past is going to be limited. To understand the past is going to be limited. It's going to be constrained by whatever is the current topic of discussion. So the trick is really to think about problems in the past and research them on their own terms. And then, but as you're researching, as you're learning things, always to have in mind the present, always to be asking, well, how does what I'm learning today about the past affect how I think about the present? I could give you an example if you would like. Well, a long time ago, I was working on banking, and I was looking at banks in the early 19th century. And I had come to research banks in the early 19th century US with a particular set of questions. And as I went into the archives, one of the first things I noticed was that the banks that I was studying were lending a disproportionate part of their funds to the people that controlled them. And so that is not the way we think about banks in the United States. We think of banks in the United States as engaged in lending at arm's length and engaged in professional lending on the basis of creditworthiness. And here I was finding that they were behaving like the banks that American policymakers decry in the global South, for example, that they were engaging in something that looked very much like crony capitalism. But that was a period when the United States was industrializing, and it industrialized very successfully. So it made me want to understand how this kind of lending system, what we today regard as corrupt, contributed to a rapid industrialization. And that brought me to explore problems of asymmetric information. And so I realized that in a developing economy where there is very poor information, lending to people you know is the best way to solve information problems, because you know a lot more about the creditworthiness of the people you are close to than you do about strangers. And so then that led me to a whole different set of questions about how that worked in a way that was conducive to industrial development and rather contrary to it, the way we often think.
So this kind of personal exchange and trust problems then
Yes.
were sort of intimately interwoven into the picture.
Yes.
So it's not this pure rational view of people.
Right, right.
It's more that what actually happened was this close-knit team of people who were trying to do something together and then gradually opening up a market.
That's right. And so what the book I wrote on it talks about is how that process unfolded and how it ultimately ends up with a professional commercial banking system of the kind we're familiar with. But it didn't start that way.
Yeah, so it started in this personal exchange fashion, trying to build something, and then it became more and more institutionalized.
Right. And then the question is, well, how is it that it had that kind of productive development? Why didn't it shut down? Why wasn't this a closed system that was antithetical to development? And that brought me to realize that one of the key features of this system was open entry into the banking sector. And so these banks were very personal. They lent money to the people who controlled them, but anyone who wanted to form a bank could form one. Okay. And so that kind of entry kept the system open and allowed people with the best projects essentially to compete through the banking system for funds in the larger economy.
So that's a sort of major policy lesson then. That if one can complain about today we call it crony capitalism and other words, but what you're suggesting is that there were this entry, right to entry then, sort of disciplined in the end, this market so that it worked for its purpose. Right.
So banks, to give a quick example, banks in early 19th century New England functioned the same way that they functioned, say, in late 19th century Mexico under the Porfiriato. But in Mexico, there were very strict limits on the number of banks that could be formed. You had to be politically well connected to be able to form a bank. And what changes in the United States in the early period is it starts out that way, where you have to be politically well connected to form a bank. But that gets overturned, and anybody who wants to can form a bank, and that's the big difference.
Oh yeah, so that's quite interesting. So continuing with these banks, at the time, there was also private currencies issued, right?
Yes.
And if you can explain that a little bit, and then maybe tie it into current events of Bitcoin and other, there are hundreds of these kind of private currencies floating around. But that was the case before central banks and so on in the world.
That's right.
At large, right?
So in the United States in that period of time, there was only briefly a central bank. But mostly the U.S. operated during the 19th century without a central bank. And in the first half of the 19th century, the central government coined money out of gold and silver, but there wasn't nearly enough to meet the public's need for currency for transaction purposes. So these banks stepped into the breach and issued their own non-interest-bearing IOUs that circulated as money. And there were many, many banks because of open entry, hundreds of banks, actually by the 1850s, thousands of banks in the United States, and they each issued their own currency. So if you were in Boston, for example, in the 1830s, there might have been 30 to 50 banks in Boston, and if you opened your wallet, you would have a rainbow of different colored notes that were issued by all these different banks. And these banks these banknotes maintained their value so long as people had faith that these institutions would redeem those notes in gold or silver if they were presented to the bank. So everything depended on people's faith in the commitment of these private institutions to redeem the currency on demand. And as long as that faith was there, people didn't bring the currency in to be redeemed, it just circulated as money. And in a way, Bitcoin is very similar in that it's a private entity that is essentially issued currency, and people's willingness to take that currency or even invest in it depends on their faith that that currency will retain its value. So Bitcoin has to make a credible commitment, for example, not to inflate its currency. And in this world where people are worried about public entities inflating currency, Bitcoin actually's credibility seems to be very strong in that its value is rising relative to that of other currencies.
So there was some sort of a break then, motivation why they didn't overprint money, right?
Yes.
So the function for these banks was transactions, I suppose. So
Well,
but they didn't overprint.
Right.
And why didn't they overprint?
Right. So that's a really good question, and it has to do with that lending policy that I talked about a moment ago. So the banks are lending money to the people who run them. The banks are like a golden goose, and the people who run the banks don't want to kill those golden geese. And so if they printed too much money, then the bank could fail and the golden goose would be dead. They wouldn't have their access to credit anymore. And so they are very careful about how they issue currency in order to keep those golden geese alive and lending them resources, lending them capital. So what you find is that there were legal limits on the amount of currency these banks could issue, but they rarely even get close to the legal limits because they're gauging the public's demand for their currency for transaction purposes and trying to stick right within that. There are also actually some private institutions that emerge to discipline them because people can't always be trusted to make the right decisions, even if they have an interest in doing that. So in New England, one bank called the Suffolk Bank takes it upon itself to discipline all the little banks by essentially accumulating the currency of these banks and returning it to their offices for redemption. And the Suffolk Bank says, well, if you maintain reserves with us against your currency issues, we won't bring this money back to you for redemption. So it's a private disciplinary device that emerges to provide credibility, an extra layer of credibility.
That's interesting,
Yeah.
very interesting. So out of this then comes some lessons, I suppose, that the central banks of the world hopefully learned, right?
Right.
But now we're in a situation where it's more difficult, I suppose, to gauge exactly the monetary volume and so on.
We are, because there are many things. I think central banks like the U.S. Fed still collect data on the money supply, but the money stock is really not countable in certain respects now because there are many things that are near money that we were talking yesterday about the little cards that stores issue, right?
There's lots of money that can't be counted for.
Right.
And
also,
there's no private mechanism either today, basically, to discipline themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the main technique we have is central bank independence. That's the technique that modern societies have developed. But central banks, even when they are independent, are still subject to political pressures. They're not as direct as when they were formal arms of the Treasury or the administration, but they're still subject to pressure.